Hello everyone, this is LATHA AKULA. In this video, we are going to start the new chapter, that is the transportation in the plants. So what is the transportation? We know that in the animals, there is a circulatory system to transport the water, minerals, oxygen and some other substances. But whereas in plants, there is no circulatory system. But plants also need to transport different substances. Okay, and here in flowering plants, the substances that are transported are water, mineral nutrients, organic nutrients and hormones and plant growth regulators. These are the several substances which are transported in the plant body. These water and mineral nutrients are taken up by the roots from the soil, and whereas food is synthesized in the leaves by means of photosynthesis, and from that leaves the food material also needed to be transported to the different parts of the plant. The plants have two broad strategies for the food system. One is a long distance transport and second one is the short distance transport. Short distance transport, it includes diffusion, cytoplasmic streaming and active transport. Whereas a long distance transport, it includes vascular system. What it consists of? It consists of conductive tissue, that is xylem and phloem. Here the transfer of substances by the xylem and phloem, that process is called as translocation. This xylem, it transports water and mineral ions from the roots to the leaves in one direction, that is from the roots to leaves, hence it is unidirectional. But whereas in the phloem, the food material that is prepared in the leaves, which may be in the form of organic or mineral nutrients, that was transported to the different parts of the plant, that is from the leaf to branches, leaf to fruits or flower or bird, or leaf to the roots. In different directions, these organic and mineral nutrients are supplied, and it is multi-directional. So in the xylem it is unidirectional manner, whereas in the phloem it is multi-directional. Whereas in senescent plant parts, what is the meaning of senescent? Are aged plant parts are which are going to death. From that the nutrients are withdrawn, and those nutrients are also be moved to the growing or young parts of the plants. In the transportation in the plants is complex process, but it is orderly manner, and each organ is receiving something and at the same time it is giving out some other substance. So now we'll see the short distance transport. Diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport, all these will come under the short distance transport. Then the first one is the diffusion. Here what is meant by diffusion? The movement of molecules or ions from the region of higher concentration to the region of lower concentration along the concentration gradient until they reach the equilibrium, that is called as diffusion. From the higher concentration to lower concentration, the molecules are moving, right? So this is called as diffusion. When the diffusion will stop? When the two regions will have the same number of molecules, then it will stop. That means if they reach the equilibrium, then the diffusion will be stopped. What is the diffusion pressure? The diffusing particles, they create some pressure, that is called as diffusion pressure, and this diffusion pressure is directly proportional to the concentration or number of particles present, and these molecules move from the higher dP to lower dP, that is higher diffusion pressure to the lower diffusion pressure. Now we will see the characteristics of the diffusion. Here the direction of diffusion of a substance, that is independent of the movement of another substances. Diffusion is the only means of gaseous transport in the plant body, but here there is no usage of any energy, right? Hence it is a slow process and not dependent on any living system. And here this diffusion is not using any energy, hence it is also called as passive process. If it is not using any energy, then it is called as passive process. If it uses energy, then it is called as active process, and it can take place in all states like liquid, solid or gaseous state. And here the rate of Diffusion is affected by some factors like a concentration gradient. What is the meaning of concentration gradient? The differences in the concentration. Permeability means the membranes which are allowing them to pass through it. So if they are permeable, then only the smell will move. Size of the molecules. If the larger the molecules, it is more difficult for the diffusion. So next, solubility of the lipids. Here the membranes, the major amount present in the membrane is the lipids. The particles are the molecules which are soluble in lipids. They can be easily transported, they can be easily diffused when compared to the molecules which are not soluble in lipids. And temperature and pressure, these are the factors that affect the rate of diffusion. Second one is facilitated diffusion. Facilitated. Here in the diffusion, the hydrophobic substances are the substances which can be easily dissolved in the lipids, that can be easily moved through the diffusion. But whereas hydrophilic substances, that is water loving substances which cannot be dissolved in the lipids, the diffusion process is a tough process. For that, for those hydrophilic substances, there is another method called as facilitated diffusion. So in the facilitated diffusion, what happens? The diffusion of the hydrophilic substances occurs along the concentration gradient through a fixed membrane transport proteins. So what are helping here for the transport of these hydrophilic substances? This is membrane transport proteins. They helps in the transport of these hydrophilic substances, and here there is no energy utilization like the diffusion, hence it is also a passive process. And here the diffusion of substances across the membrane depends on solubility. So here the substances which are soluble in lipids, they diffuse faster when compared to the substances which are not soluble, that is hydrophilic substances. It's difficult to cross the membrane. And there are certain proteins present in the membranes. Facilitated diffusion, those proteins, they provide site to pass through them to cross the membrane. Here, if all these proteins are used up, if all these proteins are used for the transport of molecules, finally these proteins, they get saturated, then the rate of transportation that reaches the maximum. That process is called as saturation. And these proteins are sensitive to inhibitor substances which react with the protein side chains. Next one is porins. So what are porins? Porins are the proteins. These are present in plastids, mitochondria, and some bacteria. These porins, they form large sized pores in the outer membrane of these plastids, mitochondria, and bacteria. From those porins, small sized particles will enter. And in facilitated diffusion, there are some extracellular molecules that bound to the transport proteins. Then these transport proteins will rotate and releases inside the cell. Examples for them were water channels. So in water channels, there are 8 different aquaporins are present. And this is the facilitated diffusion. This is the plasma membrane, transport proteins. Here, these transport proteins, they allow the passage of the molecules inside through them. And here, the molecules, they enter inside the plasma membrane. The next one is, here in passive transport, there are different methods are present. One is a Symport, Uniport, Antiport. So see here in Uniport, there is only one molecule enters at a time in one direction. In Antiport, 2 different molecules will move in opposite direction. One molecule will come inside and one molecule will go outside. That is called as anti, that means opposite direction. Symport, 2 molecules at a time will move in the same direction. This is called as Symport. So these are the 3 different methods. The next one is active transport. Here, the transport of materials across the membrane with the help of specific membrane proteins. These membranes use ATP. Up to now, we have not seen any ATP, right? Here in active transport system, these membrane proteins, they were using the ATP. Hence, it is active transport. And these membrane proteins, they were called as pumps. What are these are called as pumps. Pumps are the proteins. They use energy for carrying the substances. Without energy they cannot work, so they use energy to carry the substances and cross the membrane. And these pumps, they transport the substances against the concentration gradient. Against the concentration gradient means, concentration gradient means what? That is difference in the concentration. But here, as in diffusion, we have seen that the molecules will move from one direction to another direction, right? From higher concentration to lower concentration. But in active transportation, these molecules, they move from the lower concentration to higher concentration, that is against the concentration gradient. And here these molecules, these transport proteins, they were using ATP, right? Hence the process is faster than the passive transport. Passive transport means what? Diffusion and facilitated diffusion, where they were not using any ATP. Hence those two are called as passive transport. When compared to the diffusion and facilitated diffusion, this active transport is the faster. And the transportation, when all the proteins are used up, when all the proteins have been used up, then this will be saturated, that is called a saturation effect. Then the rate of active transport, that reaches the maximum. These carrier proteins are highly specific. As we see in enzymes, the enzymes are specific to the substrate. Like that, these proteins are also highly specific. They will not supply all the different types of molecules. They specifically carry the substances. And these are proteins, right? So these transport proteins, they were sensitive to certain inhibitors which will react with the protein side chains. This is about active transport. Now we'll see the comparison of the different transport mechanisms, that is simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. The first one is requires special membrane proteins. Diffusion, there is no uses of any special membrane proteins, but in facilitated and active transport, the proteins are present, and these are highly selective in nature. Simple diffusion is not highly selective, but facilitated and active transport, they were highly selective. Transportation saturates. Here there are no membrane proteins are used, right? Happen here. But in facilitated diffusion and active transport, membrane proteins are present. When all the membrane proteins are used up, they get saturated. Next, uphill transport. Uphill transport means what? From the lower concentration to higher concentration. Here in simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, the molecules will move from the higher concentration to the lower concentration. That is they follow the concentration gradient. But in active transport system, they will follow the against the concentration gradient, that is lower concentration to higher concentration. That process is called as uphill. In these two it is a downhill, but whereas in active transport system it is a uphill process and requires ATP. In simple diffusion and facilitated diffusion, there is no utilization of ATP. Hence these two are the passive transports. But whereas active transports, the pumps will work by using ATP, right? Hence it requires ATP. A response to the protein inhibitors. So when the protein inhibitors, where the protein inhibitors will work, because in the membrane proteins only these protein inhibitors work. In simple diffusion there is no any protein transport proteins, but in facilitated diffusion and active transport, the transport proteins are involved, right? Those transport proteins, they are sensitive to the protein inhibitors which will react with the protein side chains. So this is about the comparison of the different transport mechanisms.